Hey YouTube, this week, this is week 6 in the YouTube Pagan Challenge, and this week's topic is what are your cultural influences? And it's taken me a bit to really think on this one because I have my own personal influences, but it is a mix of things. And this particular topic could potentially end up being a can of worms. First and foremost, I would be lying if I said there weren't some cultural influences in my practice from the average American path. There seems to be this myth, and I even commented on another video in the Facebook group because she was talking about her community and how it was, cookie cutter, white bread kind of thing with kind of no culture. And I commented to say there seems to be this myth that the American culture is a culture of no culture. And that's just not true. It's just you kind of get used to seeing it if you're actually in it, so you don't see it as a different or other thing. And I know that can be problematic because certain topics that come up via internet will discuss those exotic other. For example, the influx of Eastern philosophies and Buddhist thinkings and such that happen in American communities as a lack of. I feel there's a reason why those things tend to be picked up by others. And I think if you go back far enough, you find that there isn't a true culture. Your culture, any culture that you pick up, is going to have influences from other cultures. It's simple. I mean, we know that there was major influences between a whole bunch of things. The Greco-Roman influenced a lot of things in Egypt at some point, and it doesn't stop. It never stops. Things that stop evolving die. So it's sort of, could be a can of worms topic. Me personally, the influences that I tend to have, besides the average American, I do enjoy my pumpkin spice lattes, thank you very much. And peppermint mocha everything. Yeah, like good with those. I also tend to lean towards a Celtic path. The issue that I have is anything I've looked into, like once I kind of looked into Kemetic, because when I was younger, I really enjoyed looking at the archaeological stuff and just general Egypt stuff. I loved it when I was a kid. So I thought maybe that might be a path to influence. And I'm sure there are some that have snuck through, because I know when I was reading those archaeological things that some of that stuff stuck in my brain. Like, that's how it works. But there's always other things that when I read and come across them, I just flat out don't agree with. They don't resonate with me. For example, with the Kemetic. And I know some of these are fringe, but there are groups that believe that unless you have an assigned pharaoh, you can't actually practice the religion. So naturally, there's somebody who has put himself or herself up as the position of pharaoh. And while I get why that's there, because the Kemetics believed that the pharaoh was a god incarnated. So I get the idea that you would strive for that. However, that's not the current world we live in, and so things have to adapt or die. The other issue that I had is someone had said, and I never even looked more into it, it was just an automatic, like, nope, not going to do that. They were talking about the Kemetic and how you should present yourself when you're going to do a rite. And one of those things was no wool. And I can see that too, because Egypt is not exactly in a cold climate. However, it really bothered me because I knit, I crochet, I spin fiber, a lot of that being wool. And if I were going to make an offering of some type that I put my heart and soul into, there's a very good chance that it would include some wool in it. And so that just was a no-go for me. The Celtic, while I like to have that be an influence on my own particular path, simply put, the historic evidence that isn't tainted is incredibly hard to find. And there can be some issues with pronunciation because they are not languages that I speak, and particularly Welsh. I will post probably a little caption. That town in Wales, it's got like the longest train station sign because the name is really, really long, and you get to add the Welsh, which gives you double L's and the Y's, and unfortunately there, it seems to me that the Welsh is probably the easiest one to find the most information on. I can't manage to get into any of the stories because of the issues with the names. I end up, like, in my head renaming people because I can't pronounce the Welsh pronunciation of the name. No matter how many times that it's put out for me, it's something my brain does not want to compute. Ancestrally, that's kind of where I originate from. There's my grandmother just did her DNA results. I'd like to do mine, but I don't know if that's going to happen or not. It was Scandinavian, Irish, Scottish, yeah, white, European, WASP, you know, the WASP of the ideals for a lot of Americans, having that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ideals, which is pretty much what my family comes from. I just don't agree with most of the Protestant part. And even that term itself, the WASP bit, becomes difficult because if you actually go back, the Anglo-Saxon is completely different than what people tend to think of. So you can go back and get the Germanic and Heathen stuff, which is also a fringe side of my cultural influences because that's the path that my husband follows. And so we tend to do things together sometimes. And he's got a group that, you know, families that we get together with that also do the similar things. So that is something that is influencing my path. It might be more recent, but it's there. And I don't see that as being a big issue for me either because since I lean towards Celtic, specifically if I had a choice, it would be Scottish Celtic, was very heavily influenced at some point in time by the Germanics, Anglo-Saxon thing. There are construction groups, or Celtic reconstruction groups that actually focus on that syncretism between heathen and a Celtic type of path. I have found that the full-on Celtic reconstructionism side is not for me for a couple of reasons. One, as I said, it's very hard to find the information, and I'm not interested in having to learn a secondary language to be able to practice my faith. I'm not interested in having to attend, you know, major college classes to get access to these materials. It's not to say you can't access them other ways, but it does seem to be troublesome. And it also probably got off on a bit of a wrong foot when I was at one point looking up some of the Celtic Recon stuff, because it really irritated me that the Celtic Recon in particular has a tendency to do this is what we don't do, and we're not Wicca, as I call it, the we're not Wicca-itis. They suffer from that because there is so much where people think that Wiccan equals Celtic because it was compiled, birthed, what have you, in the Celtic Isles. And that's an amalgamation and very syncretic, but because its birthplace is in England, in New Forest, England, it tends to be thought of as, oh, it's Celtic. So I found that most of the Celtic stuff is, here's what we don't do. And then you would get to something where it might be, well, what do you do? And there would be no information at all. It came down to, everyone's practice is very personal, which is fine, but an example, perhaps, something, anything, might help people get a little bit on the right track. Just say. And also, anytime you could come up with some example, there was a million people saying how it wasn't correct. 2 cardinal rules of paganism: you're not the boss of me and you're doing it wrong. It's actually, you're doing it wrong and you're not the boss of me, but they go in a cycle because if one's correct, the other one can be the answer. I just found it to be off-putting, I guess. And I find it less with some of the other cultural reconstructionisms, like the also true side of heathenry. They actually have documentation that helps. And it's beyond a couple of stories. It seems like the Celtic, it's just kind of like 3 sources. There's probably a few more, but there's 3 like major sources, because there's the Mabinogion, the Tain, and I think there's another one of the actual stories to get your lore, but they're like snippets of the actual lore. Because of the oral tradition that was the Celtic, a lot was lost forever. And then anything that was written down is through the lens of normally someone who is doing the conquest. So it becomes problematic all the way around. That being said, there is quite a bit that has managed to survive, even if it's under a veneer, and I try and look for those things. I don't necessarily care if I'm doing it in what other people think is correct or not. I don't have to share with them. Most of the time I opt not to share with them for some of the more personal things. A lot of what I do is what I do because I want to do it that way, because it resonates with me. I have my many tables of correspondences and things that I have looked at and such, and I will sometimes double check with them, but often I'm going straight to the source when I'm coming up with how to do something. I'll sit and think about it for a bit and go, now, which one makes more sense to me? And I may cross-reference and see if there's something else that may do better, but I often consult myself first. Not always. Every brain needs a little help sometimes, and sometimes you just, for the life of you, cannot think of, what was I going to use cinnamon again? Or was I going to use cinnamon? Or maybe I was going to use allspice. I forget. Let me look. Just as an example. I have an affinity for Callie. I haven't done anything specifically with her, but as far as the presentation, her story, I love it. I love, like, everything about Callie. And I tend to look away from some of the stuff that is super popular. It took me a while to actually do stuff with Bridget, because, hey, if anyone's going to go for a Celtic goddess, most likely Bridget. And there again, there's a lot of lesser known that there is, like, all you can find is one tiny little blurb, and that's like it. And there are a couple that I've found where it's one tiny little blurb and that's all you can find, and people aren't sure if it's actually a god or a goddess, or if it was just a well-known figure of the time, or they trained someone in the lore and that was their role. It can become very confusing. And that does go for any of the cultural stuff that I've looked in. It exists there too. It just tends to be, I've always felt it was more in the Celtic side because of how much was lost due to time. I think that about sums up with my cultural influences. I will, with much research, I will incorporate anything that feels correct to me regardless of the source. Now, much research being stressed on that. I am eclectic. And eclectic seems to get the same thing as, like, you know, white people don't have culture. Eclectic has gotten this bad reputation because of people who do something without thinking of it. I mean, smudging is been open for debate as to whether it's appropriate to use this in your practice. When using burnt herbs to clean things has been around for a long time and crossed cultural boundaries. It wasn't necessarily just white sage, but then again, smudging isn't just done with white sage. I have some that are cedar and juniper, and the Palo Santo wood is used, and there's sweetgrass. There's a lot of different things you can use, and you can use lavender. You can use, if it burns, it's probably been used for some purpose across cultural divides that arguably don't necessarily exist in the first place. Because it all came down to, I mean, if we tried to keep everything as separate as some online would want to make it, we would be nowhere. And you find out more when you've got someone who's actually been around the block, that there's a lot less. And yeah, when it comes to that topic, all I can say is go watch some K-pop or some J-pop videos. You'll see some great stuff. Then once, but I think that's pretty much it. Since we're focusing on my cultural influences, I've got a bit of, I prefer to go with Celtic if I can, but I have no problem if I can't find anything on the Celtic information, if I'm trying to fill that out and be actually correct about it. Sorry for the air quotes in this video, there's a lot of them. If I wanted to keep something specifically Celtic, and you can't find one particular piece of information, then I would definitely look towards the heathen side, because essentially what happened is Caesar said, everyone on this side of the river, they're Celtic. Everyone on this side, they're Germanic, they're heathen, they're Anglo-Saxon, what have you. The tribes were very interconnected, a lot more than what I think is put out. And it is, again, that's another big focus, is it was tribal. You think about here in the States, when people say, oh, this is the Native American way. Yeah, which one? Because your Nez Perce did things differently from the Hopi, did things differently from your Pacific Northwest, did things differently from the Pacific Islanders. Like, there is a lot of differences culturally within a larger culture. We are talking about Celtic was more of a language base. That's how they ended up dividing them out. It was what language they spoke, what dialect they spoke. And then you have your P Celtic, your Q Celtic. I think the Welsh is actually on something entirely different. But each tribe did things a little bit differently, even though they were the same. And that's some food for thought on that particular thing. Each tribe did things a little bit differently. So, looking at American culture, things are different in the South than they are up north. Things are different from New Jersey than they are in Oregon. There's a lot of sometimes subtle, sometimes major differences. And the same goes for Europe. I know a lot of people in America tend to think of, oh, they're European. Well, European has a lot to it. So, anyway, I think that's it for this topic.